Okay, U.S. history, you did it. You made it to the last week of school. If you're one of my students that's still submitting assignments, then good job logging in and staying on top of your work. And if you're a student who is logging in just voluntarily to watch the lesson, if you're out there, good job and way to finish strong. So, today we're going to talk about the role of media in U.S. history, or really more just the history of mass media in general. In our class in U.S. history, I would say the first real example in this class of mass media being a political force was probably Thomas Paine and Common Sense. We saw the major influence of mass printing and mass media on those revolutionary ideas, kind of encouraging the patriot movement. And then we saw it again in the abolitionist movement with Uncle Tom's Cabin, uh, really opening a lot of people's eyes up to slavery, people outside of the Deep South, the South. And then, it continued with World War II, really all of our wars in general, but especially in terms of a U.S. history class, World Wars One, Two, and then the Cold War. We talked about propaganda, political propaganda, how that's used to influence public sentiment. Um, but let's just go back to the start and talk about the history of media in general. Before mass communication, we get a form of written language around 3500 BC. It started out in stone and then eventually shifted to clay, and then papyrus, then paper, handwritten books. And you could really take that one step further, I would say, and say electronic or radio, television. But in terms of the first writing, and this is cuneiform, I believe, over here. There was no mass communication because it wasn't that easy to etch an extended paragraph into a piece of stone. All that changed with printing. Johannes Gutenberg, who you guys, since you've taken a world history class, probably heard that name. He invents the printing press. And specifically, it was movable type. In other words, you could take these individual letters and arrange them so that they're going to spell out a certain page and just run a paper through that over and over again. When you're done with that page, you could rearrange you guys get the idea. Um, Point is, it allowed them to print and distribute written material much, much faster. We get the Gutenberg Bible in 1453, which had a large influence on the church. The actual scripture was now more widely available, so peasants and other people who had been subjugated start reading it on their own, and whereas before the gospel would have been presented to them in a way that apologized for or supported the system they were in, the feudal system or the manor system. Now that they have access to it themselves, it allows more independent thought. Couple of kinds of determinism: technological determinism, which states that technology drives historical change, and then cultural determinism. Cultural determinism claims that social and economic factors and events bring about change. What do y'all think? I'm old enough to remember life without the internet, or life without cell phones. And I simply cannot tell you what a colossal impact both of those things have had, just in terms of life right now. And life right now, not to get too philosophical, but we're making tomorrow's history. So our history, our lifetimes are have been drastically changed by this new technology that really is still quite new. Photography starts to develop in the 1830s. That's why there's relatively good supply of Civil War photographs. Some of my favorite historical photos. Photojournalism, journalism in general, but photojournalism especially, blossomed, like I said, during the Civil War. And this is still true to an extent, but more so back then before mass media, or really media photojournalism, was a thing. War was definitely thought of in very romantic terms. For the Civil War, for example, the early battles, people would bring blankets and picnic baskets and would picnic on the side of a hill and watch the fighting like they were at a football game, because they had never seen a photograph of a guy with his head blown off. And I'm not making light. That's just the effect that seeing a real photograph can have on somebody. Telegraphy, um, one of the first ways of uh, communicating in an extremely rapid way. That's why they called it the great annihilator of time and space. Telephone, there were numerous scientists and inventors working on comparable devices, but Alexander Graham Bell was the one who got the patent. So he's credited with inventing the telephone. Motion pictures, at first, they were documentaries until the Great Train Robbery in 1903. And that was the first sort of what we would think of like an action film, except it was 12 minutes long. I don't know about y'all, but I love cinema. I think it's cool. It's a terrific medium. Popular culture in the United States. We talked about this when we talked about the Roaring Twenties, but with movies and magazines, it allowed products to be marketed nationally, and created this kind of phenomenon of a national celebrity. So just changing society. Radio was the first mass media. In other words, media that the masses had access to. And people used to crowd around the radios for hours, just like we do now with our phones or computer or television. Radio was used by a lot of different types of people. Oops. But I would say the one man who really took advantage of radio as a platform was Franklin Roosevelt. Of course, we talked about him and his fireside chats. There's a reason people listened to those. A, there wasn't a lot of other entertainment, choices. You didn't have 1,000 other channels, but those things gave comfort to a nation that really needed comfort. Um, and radio was, of course, the predecessor to television. TV, they called it a disruptive medium, and people expected live coverage of news events. So we start to see um, the emergence of television journalism. And do you guys know what that means when I say creates deep reservoir of communal experiences? Communal experiences meaning sort of experiences that everybody's having. In other words, now that there's television, the family in Wisconsin can be watching the same television show as the family in New England who's watching the same thing as the ones in Georgia. So suddenly, that's three families who otherwise would have never interacted really in any way, um, who now have consumed the same product. So it contributes to uh, an American culture. The internet, mid 90s, a great time. Completely changed everything. Right now, I'm talking to you on a computer that was filmed with a program that lets me record my screen, and you guys are watching it via YouTube. You click on a link. I mean, that the fact that we couldn't even go to a school building, but we were able to keep going really without missing a beat. That's technology. Uh, so it just is, it expanded that phenomenon of communal experiences because now it's global, and it really changed really everything. Newer trends, smartphones, mobility. First car phones, I remember a kid named Preston that I played Little League with. His dad had a Jaguar, super cool, and it had a car phone. The car phone was like the size of a shoebox. Now I have a computer in my hand, in my pocket at all times, just in the form of an iPhone. And social media. In my government class, a couple of times there were major news events that happened. And when the students were familiar with those events, if I asked them, like, whoa, how'd you know about that? The answer was almost always Instagram or social media. Um, Social media is absolutely changing the face of history as we speak. Way to go, guys. Person of the year. So look at this. TV glasses projected in 1963 versus what they look like today. This is supposed to be the future because he's having a telecall with him. I would say it's much more advanced than that. All right, guys. With that, we'll shut it down for the day. There's no assignment due tomorrow. So just want you to watch this and hopefully you learned something.